Today's webinar on crisis communication. Unfortunately, Liz Poland, our CEO, was not able to attend today. I am Felice Banner, Director of Education here at STC. We want to especially welcome those of you who are new to STC. The Society for Technical Communication is an individual membership organization, and we're dedicated to the development and dissemination of technical communication knowledge and skill. STC membership provides access to first-class technical communication education, award-winning publications, certification, career development, professional networking opportunities, and other exclusive member benefits. Our mission is to advance members' professional development. This mission benefits consumers worldwide, and this webinar is just one example of the ways technical communicators make a difference in the world by making important communications clear to all. We hope you enjoy the webinar and consider joining STC if you're not yet a member. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, John Hedke. John has been an STC member since 1986. He is an STC fellow. He's published over 27 books. 27 books? More than 27 books.
27 books at this point.
Including The Complete Idiot's Guide to Disaster Communication, and he lives near Tacoma, Washington. I have known John for close to 20 years through the Society for Technical Communication, and I value his insight, expertise, and mentorship. Over to you, John.
Thank you. All right, and there we go, get the focus. This is us. Thank you all for coming, by the way. I have not, this is the first time I've done this. This seminar actually was a gleam in Felice's eye Friday morning. So I've pulled this together. I have not had a chance to time everything. It is possible we will run a little short. I can stay if you can, no worries. Here's this. We're giving the entire slide deck out so you can look at this later in order to appreciate me more. But let's get right into the presentation. What we're going to be talking about is elements of crisis communication from a business perspective for the technical communicator or PR professional who's been called on to prepare communications about some emergent situation that directly affects the well-being of your company, its employees, its customers, and possibly other people. We are going to talk about the following general topics. We're going to talk about differentiating between disasters, catastrophes, and crises, understand the general steps for crisis communication, dealing with a crisis if you don't have a plan. And I have a feeling that a great many people are here because they're going, oh my God, we haven't got a plan. What do we do now? And there are ways you can pull a great win out of all of this. Dealing with COVID-19 and its effects, which is probably triggering a lot of you as well, and resources for further information. All right, disasters, catastrophes, and crises. We need to talk just a little about disasters and catastrophes to give you some basic concepts. A disaster is any situation in which your needs to respond exceed your available resources. Now, people usually think of a disaster as a specific type of incident, a flood, a tornado, an earthquake. And these are certainly each disasters, but they're all situations in which the resources you can muster in response are not sufficient to your needs. It may be easier to think of this in financial terms. You need to write a bigger check than the money you have in your bank account at the moment. In a disaster, an incident occurs or a situation develops where you know what the necessary response is, but the sheer magnitude of the need outstrips the people, the supplies, the time available to mount an appropriate response. Now, a catastrophe is a situation in which your needs exceed all ability to respond. And it's really different from a disaster in terms of scale. There are two ways you can have a catastrophe. The first is where you know what the response is, but it's just overwhelming. You cannot do anything to mitigate the situation. For example, Southern California has an 8.1 earthquake. Nothing you could do will mitigate this. It's going to be just too darn big. A cluster of tornadoes hits downtown Houston. These would be catastrophes. No amount of planning or preparation is going to make any significant difference in the devastation that's going to result from those two pretty horrible situations. The second way a catastrophe can occur, though, is you have a disaster and it gets out of hand. This is a situation where you don't know what the appropriate response is, or you haven't adequately practiced your response. And even though the magnitude of the need is less than the resources, you can't respond effectively because you've lost your focus on it. You might have, for an example, an opportunity to cut off a wildfire from spreading into a nearby housing development by cleaning out the brush in between the fire and by fielding enough firefighters in the area to shovel dirt on the fire and smother it. But if you didn't know how to clean out the brush and didn't have the firefighters in that area to shovel dirt, and didn't make the fire break wide enough, the fire could spread through a whole new area to the point that you have no way of extinguishing it, and that's a catastrophe. This next one, all disasters are the same disaster. Now, when I learned this, when I was writing the very first chapter of the Disaster Preparedness book, I was doing this with a fascinating guy who is normally an ER doctor, but he also runs national medical response teams. We wrote the book about 11 years ago, and in the middle of all of it, I got a phone call from him. He was called out. He was on his way to Galveston, Texas, to Galveston Island, because he had to run the medical response team after Hurricane Ike, things like that. And he explained to me that all disasters are the same disaster. And yes, there are some differences. A pandemic is not the same as a flood, and it's not the same as an earthquake, but the difference is actually only superficial. And the reason is while you're going to do some things differently for each one, all of them have this in common. They magnify your needs in common ways and on common paths, regardless of the specific cause of the disaster. So most of the planning and preparation for disasters of any kind is the same. You don't have to make one set of plans for a tornado and a second for a pandemic and a third for a wildfire and a fourth for toxic spills. Effective disaster planning tends to be comprehensive. Next, all disasters are local disasters. Now, a disaster can be local, it can be regional, it can be worldwide. COVID-19 is worldwide, and yet the effects are always going to be felt locally by the people who are reading your communication. And you need to keep that in mind as you communicate about what's going on. Different localities are going to have different probabilities of a specific hazard occurring. There are not going to be a whole lot of major earthquakes in downtown Houston. There's probably not going to be a whole bunch of tornadoes in Southern California. And yet, you need to treat all these as being a local event regardless. It also will remind you, as well as disaster planners in general, the first 72 hours of any response will be in the hands of local officials, local organizations, and so on. Now, a crisis is any situation that threatens your business's finances or reputation, or that may cause a safety issue, physical, financial, emotional, for your customers, employees, and so on. Now, by definition, a crisis is pretty much always a disaster or even a catastrophe, but the disaster or catastrophe can be something that only affects the business in question. You have an earthquake or a fire, it knocks out your company headquarters, that's certainly a disaster. But what if your servers are down and nobody can get into your company's website and you're a web-based business? That's a crisis. It's possibly even a disaster, maybe, but it's not going to be a catastrophe unless it's a colossal outage that's affecting more people. What about a hack that exposes your customers' personal data to the world? Now, that's a disaster for your company, certainly. What if your entire board of directors is indicted for gross fraud, conspiracy, and swindling? That's probably a catastrophe. All of these situations, though, are going to be a crisis, at least for your company, and they need to be handled immediately. Finally, almost all companies are going to have a crisis sooner or later. And I'd like to point out that a lot of companies have like incident response plans. Incidents usually tend to be inward facing. Crises are usually outward facing, at least so far as the employees go, and very possibly further than that. We're going to have a few comments on creating a crisis management plan. But again, I'm kind of betting on the fact that a lot of people do not currently have one, and we're going to talk a lot about what you do when you don't. Obviously, be ready before a crisis hits. You need a plan for how you're going to respond to a crisis. Keep it up to date. It should include names, titles, phone numbers for all the executives, a plan for what will initiate a crisis management event, and the general steps for handling it. By definition, a crisis management plan can only be general because you don't know what the crisis will be. You may also want to have some predefined press releases and email templates for initial crisis communications on several topics so that you're ready to go instantly. The plan should be maintained securely, but it should be easy to get to. Moreover, it's a good idea to have printed or thumb drive copies of the plan available to key stakeholders. It's all well and good to say, just go to the SharePoint location and download the latest version. But if your crisis is that your server room caught on fire and burned to the ground, nobody is getting the crisis management plan off of SharePoint for a very long time. By the way, no matter how big your list of specific disasters, you can't plan for everything. You'd have to include asteroids, global warming, fire ants, and spontaneous human combustion. Plans that only address specific disasters are unwieldy. Worse, when you get something unexpected happening, you have no plan. There have been cases where companies in Florida have had, excuse me, they have had a hurricane. Hurricanes spawn tornadoes on the outskirts, so they also got hit by a tornado. There was a flood surge caused by the hurricane, so the lower couple of floors of the business got flooded, and this caused an electrical short, and they had a fire. All four at once. You could not plan for that. It's going to be a really bad day, I grant you, but practice your plan at least once a year. Everybody on the plan is responsible for being involved in a test of it at least once a year and preferably twice a year, because you want everyone to be familiar enough with the steps in the plan that start a crisis event and run through all of the steps and approvals and so forth. And you don't want it to be a surprise to anybody. You might want to have, as I say, some predefined press releases ready for that kind of a circumstance, and then update the plan whenever things change. If someone leaves the company, they move to a different position, or their position is filled by another person, the person maintaining the crisis management plan, us probably, is going to have to make sure that that the new people are aware of their roles in a crisis and involve them in the next practice session. Now, crisis management plans, I want to say, they are fascinating, but it would take a whole hour and more to talk about them. The resources page I will be showing you at the end and that you will be getting in the handout gives you a website with half a dozen sample crisis management plans you can model from. And I would like to add, you shouldn't try to buy a canned crisis management plan, because you should always build this for yourself to meet your company's specific needs and focus. Right. Steps in communicating in a crisis. I'm going to run through these and then we're going to go into more detail. You need to respond quickly and accurately. When you have a crisis, you can't ignore it. You absolutely have to respond as soon as possible. You should be consistent with your message. It may evolve as you find out more about the situation or the situation itself evolves, but it needs to be consistent no matter what. Be preposterously transparent. You don't want to look like you're hiding anything. Your ability to say what's going on and maintain your company's reputation and brand, and trust me, that is a great deal of what all of this is about, depends on your audience believing you. Take responsibility. Not all disasters are things you're responsible for. Quakes, wildfires, and so on happen. You have no control. But if the crisis is because someone at your company was careless, you need to acknowledge this very quickly. Communicate a lot. Not all situations require daily bulletins, but some crises do. Some crises may require announcements every few hours or even more often, depending on the crisis. Don't be a jerk. Not rocket science, but based on the number of companies who have messed up in their crisis communications, by coming across as unsympathetic or unconcerned, this maybe isn't so obvious. And finally, you need to do a wrap up. As things calm down, you should have some kind of a final communication or two that says, yes, the situation is wind down, you've accomplished X, the path going forward with respect to the crisis is Y, and if appropriate, that you, the company, have new processes and procedures in place to prevent whatever it is from happening again, or mitigating it if it does, if it's something out of your control. All right, respond quickly and accurately. Get on top of the situation right away. You want to do everything you can to get ahead of bad news. Well, many things are truly unpredictable. Showing that you're responding quickly is a very good way to instill confidence in your employees and customers. Failure to respond effectively will result in additional damage to the company. Even if you have no information at all, start by saying, there is a situation of thus and such nature, and this is what little we know about it. Even if it's local news, it can go global instantly. As part of your need to respond quickly, you need to take into account that social media has the potential of making anything that's local into something that's on the world stage. Social media is the embodiment of the adage that a lie can circle the globe while the truth is getting its boots on. But even if what's being said is absolutely true, discovering that while you are formulating a response to something, there have been 3 million views of a YouTube video that's highly embarrassing to your company puts you in an impossible situation. The worst mistake you can make in any crisis communication is to look like you're being evasive. If you don't respond quickly, you're going to look like you're hiding something. But if something happens and you respond within an hour with a message about what's happening and what you're going to be doing about things, it gives you a lot more control. Be as complete and correct as you can. When you're making a crisis announcement of any kind, particularly an initial announcement, you probably don't have a heck of a lot of information. Admit that you don't know what you don't know, but do say that you're finding out. It is okay to say, I don't know, particularly in the early days of a problem. If you don't know, then go on to set your audience's expectations for when you can get more info, and then do something at that time. Even if you have to say, yes, I said 8 hours ago that I would give you an update, and I'm sorry, we don't have information about X, and here's why. And I'm very sorry, and I will get back to you at this time, and then make the darn date. Always deliver on your promises as best you can. Be consistent with your message. You need to tell the same story across platforms, regardless if this is at a press conference, on your website, on social media. Your communications must always tell the same story. As part of this, you want to use the same language, the same phrasing, the same descriptions, and so on. Everything should have the same message regardless of platform. They do not have to be cookie cutters, although much of a press release may end up being a cookie cutter from platform to platform. But you don't want, say, separate groups talking about things differently, and then people will come back to you and say, well, so-and-so said here that X, but you're saying Y. What's going on, please? Where is the difference, and why aren't you talking to each other? And all of a sudden, you're playing a very defensive strategy. Everyone should always have the same message. And the idea of everyone pulling together is not only good for getting things done, obviously, but it's also the external perception, real key idea here, that the company is staying on message. And never, ever, 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 ever lie about anything. It is okay, as I mentioned, to be unsure about things, but you need to say, I don't know, or I'm unsure, or I don't have the information, and here's why, and then give them whatever the reason is for why. If you tell the tiniest lie about anything, you're going to be playing defense. Nobody will believe anything you say, and your life will become a raging sea, not only for this crisis, but very possibly for years to come with anything the company has to say. Be preposterously transparent. That goes hand in glove with the idea of being accurate and not telling a lie. You want to let people see how you're addressing the issue. Um, you want to let them see how you're making decisions, how you're getting info, what steps you're taking to solve the problem as it's reflected in the company's operations. Now, they may feel a certain sense of ownership as a result of this. They may possibly disagree with what you are doing and will probably tell you, but they will be definitely more inclined to believe that the company is doing something in a concrete and measurable way, even if perchance they don't agree with what you're doing. And maintain the company's reputation and brand. I'd like to pause for a moment. We are talking about people. We are talking about lives. We are talking about people's finances. We are talking about communities and all sorts of things that all are a people issue. Yet, when we are doing crisis communication, we are also reflecting our company's reputation and brand and priorities. And as long as we're not doing something unethical in the doing of it, there is no problem with maintaining the company's reputation and brand. You need to do what you can in your crisis communications to align your communications with your company's reputation and brand. During a crisis, the company's reputation is frequently going to be the thing that suffers first. Take responsibility. Again, if the crisis is because someone at your company was careless, own up to your mistakes. Your company's carelessness allowed hackers, say, to compromise your data security, or the company failed to plan and had inadequate backups when a fire hit their server room and everything went away and it's, everything is lost. Your company needs to acknowledge this. You really stepped in it, own it. If somebody at your company screwed up, you need to admit it. Yes, it's very possible by saying, we really screwed up here, that lawsuits could happen depending on the company's carelessness or whatever. But don't kid yourself. If you're in that kind of a situation, lawsuits are going to happen anyway. You're at this point, you're on a defense game. It's true. And you're trying to save what you can of the company's reputation, saying we screwed up and we're sorry. And here's how we are working to fix it and be open and honest. And this will go a whole lot farther than saying, no, nothing happened. Why are you talking to us? You're trying to mitigate the reputational damage to the company, your employees, your customers, and public perception in general. And don't blame other people. If you're busy blaming other people, you're ignoring the people affected by the crisis. Even if it's not something the company did and it's patently obvious that somebody else did something, you're not going to gain anything right now by pointing fingers. So don't do it. It never plays well. Communicate a lot. As I mentioned before, commit to a schedule for communications and keep it. How often you communicate depends on the situation. Now, a lot of the communication right now about COVID-19 is largely of the one and done sort, where we are getting lots of emails saying, because of the coronavirus, we're suspending all on-site operations for the next month, kind of an announcement. As a matter of fact, somebody made the observation about I never knew how many places my email was until I started getting email from all of these companies that I'd forgotten I'd ever talked to about their COVID-19 response. But other crises may require daily or hourly results. For example, something all too often, an ex-employee has gone to an office site and taken their former boss hostage. Really bad scene. What can you say about this? Well, probably the first thing you're going to know is that there is a hostage situation at a company location, and you probably don't have a lot of other information. It's also possible you can't release some of the information like who the ex-employee is or the boss or anything like that, because the police will have control of the situation and they prefer that you say nothing. So your initial announcement would probably be something like, at approximately 10:40 a.m. today, someone we believe to be an ex-employee entered our company location in wherever and has taken at least one person hostage. We have no other information at this time, but we will provide you with updates as soon as we have them, and we will return within an hour, even if we don't have additional news, just to let you know that we are here. you'll probably have something to say within an hour on a situation like that, and frequently for every hour thereafter for the next day or two. But tell your audience up front you're going to get back to them every hour or so when there's a new development, and keep to that schedule. And this phrase, this sentence really, I think, is probably the whole presentation in a nutshell. Nobody will be able to say for sure if you're over communicating, but they will know instantly if you're under communicating. Everybody write that one down. Always err on the side of telling people a little too much. If you've told them things in great detail, chances are you're not going to be accused of hiding something. Always put yourself in your audience's shoes. Think of what you'd like to hear if you're in the audience. Would you feel like you're being given a lot of hand waving? Would your comments make you feel more or less trusting of the company saying it if you were hearing them? Try out your crisis communication statements with other people, particularly other people who are not involved, and see what they think. Many companies have made things far worse for themselves in this situation by delivering a response to a situation that came off as snotty, unsympathetic, and or evasive. T, there we go. Don't be a jerk. First and foremost, and this goes back to the idea of don't be snotty. It's not about you. When you're standing there delivering a message, when you are writing something that's going out to the press or going onto the website, whatever, your company may well have, depending on the crisis, done vile, awful things that are causing all kinds of problems, but the crisis isn't about you. Your audience is going to want to know how it affects them, such as, will the company continue to offer services? If so, how? Will the company remain in business? Will I, an employee, have a job? Will it be the same job? If the company is closing temporarily, how will this affect my paycheck? Will the company be able to mitigate my own loss of income? As a customer, do I have alternatives? How can the company work with me to maintain some level of services? What is the company going to do to mitigate the current crisis? And indeed, in all of the COVID-19 announcements about what companies are doing and how they're reacting, you can see a whole range of responses to this. Some are better than others, very definitely. You want to think about how your employees, your customers, and the public are going to feel about the company based on your statements about what the company is doing. Be an adult. This is asking an awful lot of a number of C-level executives we all know or have known, but it's surprising just how badly things go off the rails at this stage. A CEO or a spokesperson can say the wrong thing and poof, all sympathy vanishes. And here is possibly the biggest blunder of all. When the British oil platform blew up in the Gulf of Mexico, it killed 11 people. It caused tens of billions of dollars of financial damage to the Gulf of Mexico. It caused unimaginable ecological damage and so forth. And the CEO, Tony Hayward, put his foot in it by saying, and this is a quote, "There's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. I'd like my life back." The general reaction was, good on you, Tony. What about the 11 people who died? What about all the rest of us? It did not go well for him. He tried apologizing. No, didn't work. Think about the future. It's not just enough that your company survives the crisis right now. It also has to make plans to be in business in the future. If, for example, you make it clear in the way you're talking about things that you just don't care how your employees are going to survive if you close the business for 3 weeks or a couple of months or whatever, you may not have quite as many employees when you return. And similarly, doing something that shows that you are taking advantage of your customers, and this has come to life due to this crisis, will lead you to have none. Once trust is broken, it's a very long journey to get it back. The long and short of it is, if you're a jerk, don't get in front of the cameras. Finally, in this section, wrap up. You need to put out a final communication to your audience, reiterate the things that you've done, give them some idea of what the company will be doing going forward and the like. Acknowledge the people affected by the situation. Apologize again if that's appropriate under the circumstance. Then you, the crisis communications professional, you should do an internal postmortem. Like all postmortems, you want to look at the things that worked well, things that didn't work well. Did you have rough spots? Were there gaps in your crisis management plan? Did somebody go off script? Was there a particular need from your audience that you weren't meeting or that you delivered well? Are there changes to the process that would make things work better? And then document all of this for the next time. You want to document the whole thing that happened, good or bad, so the next time a crisis happens, you may have some guidance about what to do based on what happened the last time. Include all of this as an attachment or even an appendix to the crisis management plan so it does not get lost. You might also consider a one sheet of lessons learned of the do this and don't do that sort. Key phrases to avoid. No comment. I can't even say that with a straight face. If you say no comment, people are going to fill the comment in for you in their heads, and they will be certain you know more than you're telling. Now is not the time to be evasive. I'll have to get back to you on that. Sounds very much like a put off. If you don't know, simply say, I don't know, followed by what you may need to do to find out. And you may not know what that is either. But if that's the case, admit to it. I mean, it's okay to say, gosh, this has happened. We haven't a bloody clue on what's going on, and I'm sorry. Here's the steps we're going to do to find out. You know, it's okay to be confused for at least a little while you're getting grips on the thing. Similarly, the phrase, we'll have to discuss that, should be used with great care because it implies there will be less than open discussions and cover up and even legalisms going on. That won't matter. Bad phrase, maybe it will matter, maybe it won't matter, but the people affected by this crisis and your company's handling of it may feel like whatever it is that you're trying to brush off matters a great deal, so you do not want to dismiss their needs. All right, here's the section that probably a lot of you are interested in. Dealing with a crisis if you don't have a plan. We're going to pause for a second for tea. Now, as I say, I think a lot of you are probably motivated to attend this webinar because you don't have a crisis management in place. Let me assure you, your company can still survive and thrive even when you are not prepared, and even when you've planned for reasonable hazards such as floods, fire, and quakes. You may not be able to handle an event that is so novel that it wasn't anticipated, like COVID-19. Even without a plan, there are 6 steps you can follow that will greatly improve your chances of weathering a crisis successfully with your business intact. And they are, don't panic, use common sense, work smarter, not harder, don't wander, seek help, and mitigate outrage. And now we're going to go through these individually. Don't panic. Obvious. Not panicking is far easier sometimes said than done, but fear and panic can cause even the best leaders to act for the sake of acting. And it's possible that doing something may be inspiring and courageous and even the right action, but it's also possible that just going out there and doing something for the sake of doing something can cause financial loss, physical damage, or injuries. You need to think strategically. Strategic thinking is a skill that you may need to practice, obviously. Most people tend to think of things tactically, figuring out what will get you from A to B instead of A to Z. So when dealing with a crisis, you really need to think strategically. With strategic thinking, of course, you know what you're trying to accomplish. And with a plan in place from that, the tactics for accomplishing the plan can start falling into place. Third, it gives you a sense of confidence because you know what you're trying to do. You can tell people what you're trying to get to. I mentioned, remember Brown's Law. This is something that came up during the Disaster Preparedness book writing. And as I say, my co-author, Maurice, is an ER doc. And he says Brown's Law is if a patient is still breathing, You have time to think. And I thought that was a great role for disaster preparedness. In the middle of a crisis, as long as there is not an immediate and direct threat to life, limb, or property, you need to stop and think. You need to know what's happening, what the immediate threats are, and what risks you are likely to face. When you're facing a crisis, take a moment, take a breath. It's calming. It forces you to stop for a second. If it's a really hot kind of crisis, take a second breath. You might even take your own pulse, which tends to be calming and refocuses you. And if your heart's really pounding, as is usually the case when facing an imminent crisis, it'll help you realize you're feeling a little hyped up. Gather information at this point. Think about what you're going to do, what you need to find out, and so forth. Crisis management involves gathering information at all levels. You'll have the macro strategic, the 30,000 foot view, the strategic, the view from the rooftop, operational, view from the street, tactical, view from the trenches, and micro tactical, which is perhaps most important in my opinion, the view through the eyes of the employees and customers. The type of information you're going to gather depends on the role you're filling in the organization. Once you've gathered the information, you can assess the full extent of the crisis on your business. Macro strategic is going to be CEO or the business over or whoever is in charge. And the boss needs to know what's going on so they can formulate a strategic plan. Then one notch below that are the people who know the plan, but they don't have the power to change it. Their job is to take the plan, break it into individual parts, and hand it down. The operational level is middle managers. They know what's going on at the bottom level, but they're just monitoring on it. But the one other thing they can do is flag for up above what's going on. And if something's going wrong, it's probably not their job to fix it. They just need to report there's something going wrong and a course change needs to be made. The tactical level is the group supervisors, the operational heads, the shop foreman, if it's that kind of a business. They're going to be monitoring heavily what's going on and report this up the chain, good or bad, to the middle managers and then up the chain from there as necessary. And at the bottom, the employees, the customers, the people who are actually in the trenches, who are either dealing with the customers or the customers themselves, and they are actually the ones wielding pick and shovel, so to speak. In general, everyone should know the plan one level up and one level down from where they are. They shouldn't know directly what's going on further away than that because it's just too much information. The people at the top shouldn't need to know what's going on specifically at the shop floor level, and the workers at the bottom of the pyramid don't need to know what's going on at the very top level. Everybody just needs to know what's the next thing they need to do. A common mistake during a crisis, as well as common business mistake, I should add, is for the senior people to micromanage. They get scared. They don't trust the people at the bottom. It's not the role for the senior people to know what's going on at the bottom. Instead, the very best way to manage during a crisis is to not change your operational response at all. It should be business as usual as much as possible. As an example, crews in the engine room of a nuclear sub do not know when there's a hurricane blowing overhead. There is no reason to restrict this information, but it won't do anything useful for them, and it won't help them accomplish their jobs. The captain needs to worry about that, but he doesn't need to worry about how something got lashed down in the engine room because it was swinging back and forth. I'm going, for the sense of time, I'm going to skip over little stuff about micromanaging. We all know what micromanaging is and what to say about it. Use common sense. Gathering information is vital, but you should use common sense too. If there's something obvious you can do that will stem the deepening of a crisis, do it. It can also help you another way. The rules of business and the laws of nature do not change in a crisis. So if the action you're thinking of taking wouldn't make sense when there is no crisis, it's unlikely to be productive during a crisis. Don't overthink things as a result. You want to avoid analysis paralysis. You keep looking at the issues, never come to conclusions, and the crisis will worsen without response as time goes on. So similarly, don't try for a perfect answer. As most of us have heard, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Good is just fine. Close enough is not just for hand grenades and horseshoes. Avoid framing bias. I'll talk to you just a bit about that. The tendency to view a problem differently because of the way in which it's stated. For example, if I said to you, your business has a 20% chance of failing as a result of this crisis, it's technically the same thing as if I said, your business has an 80% chance of surviving the crisis, but focusing on failure rather than success makes the statements appear to be saying different things. When you're evaluating what the information you gather, keep in mind what your framing biases are, because they can make you focus on the wrong things and they can prevent you from identifying things you do need to focus on. Make sure you ask yourself the right question. For example, if you had a flood, the right question may not be, how can I get the business open, or even how can I provide services to my customers, but instead, how can I get my employees to come back to work? Don't try to ignore your framing biases. Instead, acknowledge them, take them into account in your deliberations so that you don't give them too little or too much weight by trying to deny that you've got any of these. Keep looking at the way you're framing problems. One of the best techniques for this and everything else is a thing that I read about 40 years ago called power thinking, a phrase that is used a lot for many different things. Instead of saying, I want to get my employees to come to work, but there's increased risk in having too many people in the same place, instead change the but to an and. So you say, I want to get the employees to come to work, and there's increased risk in having too many people in the same place. The first sentence is a complete thought that really doesn't take you anywhere. It's a encapsulated view of the universe, and it stops. So in the second one, it's framed more like you're setting up the parameters of a problem. So with the second, you might say, okay, if there's increased risk in having too many people in the same place, how else can I get the employees to come to work? Work smarter, not harder, a phrase that I think all of us have gotten sick of, frankly, but it's nevertheless appropriate. You want to rely on your past successes as best you can and use pattern recognition so that you can match the current situation to as many of the levels of observation with prior situations. And the best matches are going to predict how well something's going to come to be the outcome of what you're doing. Conversely, if something you did before blew up in your face, well, don't do it now. And I use this phrase, use heuristic deduction, because it is such a mouthful of rather presumptuous garbage that I think you'll remember it. It basically means take a walk in somebody else's shoes, infer their needs and even their responses based on your needs and responses when in the same situation. And so you need to have some empathy. And honestly, not everybody does. Be on the lookout for that in the people that you have working with you in a crisis. You probably have already done a lot of this. If you said, how would the customers respond if we did X, or imagine how your employees or families would react to various kinds of news, that's heuristic deduction. You can use this, of course, to make predictions about behavior and things like that. And that's all I'll say. Don't wander. A lot of things here. Wandering is losing sight of your goals and objectives. Not only do you need to remain focused and work toward the desired ends, you need to do this effectively. This is known as triage. You determine your priorities and go from there. Business triage is no different. You prioritize your goals and your outcomes and your processes, and then you allocate the resources appropriately based on the relative importance. A triage is not simply sorting the most important project or business goal or even critically ill patient to the front of the line. It's determining what resources are available and how they can serve the largest number of goals, the largest number of people at any given moment in time. Triage is a continuous repeating process. In business, this means that you must continually reassess the resources available at hand as they are used up and replenished, and you also need to reassess the needs and goals of the company on an hour by hour or even minute by minute basis as the situation demands. Identify your outcomes. I'd like to mention something I've mentioned in at least half a dozen books. thing called Magee's Law, and it is this: it doesn't matter how you get there if you don't know where you're going. This applies to almost everything where there is planning and a goal. So the first step in your business triage is to identify and categorize your outcomes, which can be goals or objectives, as the case may be. Critical, essential outcomes are those that occur to meet your that are important for meeting your overall mission. Urgent and important outcomes are those that facilitate this but are not absolutely essential. And supportive and optional outcomes are those that may well support things but aren't necessary. Identify your processes. Similarly, critical, urgent, supportive. Assign resources and priorities. With your list of goals and processes, you're ready to assign the resources, and we're all used to that, honestly. I don't think I need to tell you about that. Avoid expensive short-term tactical gains. When you're making decisions about your priorities, you should avoid short-term tactical gains that will have long-term expensive strategic costs. For example, on a personal level, if your job suddenly went from full-time to part-time, and you got the maximum cash advance from your credit cards to meet your immediate expenses, you'd have a short-term tactical gain, the bills got paid, but a long-term strategic cost, repaying all the high-interest cash advances. Don't do that. You'll also need to set boundaries. Consider bullseyes, budgets, and boundaries. Bullseyes are individual tactical goals that the workers at the bottom level are working on. Individual bullseyes need to prioritize so you can set their budget and the number of resources you're going to allocate to them. And once the bullseyes and the budgets are set, specifies the boundaries, which are the time, resource, and working environment limits for the workers. More tea, excuse me a sec. Seek help. Don't go it alone. There is strength and creativity in numbers. Another reason, I might add, why you should be members of the STC. Although this should go without saying, it is essential that when a crisis strikes, you should seek advice from as many experts as you can conveniently as to the best ways to manage things. This might be your first flood, but there are people who deal with this kind of issue regularly. You also should look for help and advice to communicate about the situation and the risks. This way you can keep the crisis from becoming a potential public relations catastrophe. Mitigate outrage. I haven't really mentioned outrage before, but if you stop and think, outrage is what is happening in a crisis. People are outraged at circumstance, at the company perhaps, at something, but it is upsetting to their life in some fashion. And you want to do what you can to mitigate this sense of outrage on the part of your employees, your customers, and the public. The secret of this is to set the expectations appropriately so you can meet them effectively. A good way of thinking of it is outrage is the difference between your experience and your expectations. You want to mitigate that potential as much as you can. You cannot affect someone's perception of an experience, but you can definitely set their expectations. In this way, a business can mitigate or even eliminate outrage entirely and change thereby the way your employees and customers feel about you. Create your message. The expectation you create for others is based on what you put out there. For example, if you take a seat in an ER, Maurice told me about this, you're usually told that you'll be seen by the doctor in 15 minutes. Well and good, but if it actually takes 20 minutes to do the paperwork, you're going to be a little cranky. So you'll feel they're running late, slowly or inefficiently. Your expectations were set and then not met. On the other hand, if you go to Disneyland, Disney World, it doesn't matter. They do a wonderful job of setting expectations. If you were the first person in through the gates and you dashed off to Space Mountain by being the first person there, you'll pass a sign where the waiting lines extend that says 15-minute wait from this point. Now, there may be no one in front of you, and it may be less than 5 minutes to get from there to the ride, but the sign is carefully tailored to set your expectation that it'll take 15 minutes to get on the ride. And then when you get on the ride 10 minutes faster than that, you think you've gotten something for free. thinking you saved 10 minutes, not that it took you 5 minutes to get there. And there are things like this throughout Disney. So what you tell your employees and your customers and the public is important. Winston Churchill said, if you mean to profit, learn to please. You need to show what effects the crisis is having on your business and how this will affect the workplace and your customers and the community. In addition, you need to set the expectations for what you'll do during the crisis and then come in bigger and ahead of schedule. The old business rule of under promise and over deliver is never truer than during a crisis. So to summarize this section, even if you did not have a plan, failing to plan is not planning to fail. You can make a go of this and succeed handsomely without a crisis management plan. Sure, planning is better, but we're here and now, and this is what we got, and we need to do what we can. Be confident. One of the best ways to inspire people and instill confidence is to not panic in the face of crisis and to act with calm deliberation. The true leader remains a leader in a crisis or out of it. The bad leader becomes a worker bee. The best crisis is never noticed. It's one in which the worker bees and your customers never notice something has changed. Finally, manage expectations and you'll be a hero. If you manage the expectations well, as I was illustrating briefly, people won't get upset. They'll be happier with the outcomes and appreciate the things you've done for them. Now let's talk some basics of COVID-19, and we're close to on time. First, COVID-19 is not the flu. By the way, I actually have some qualifications in this that I'm not going to bore you with, but I really do know a great deal about what I'm talking about here. Flu virus and coronaviruses are entirely different. Moreover, flu vaccine has no effect on COVID-19, although everyone should still get a flu shot because it is possible to have both diseases at once. Your chances of survival are not going to be great, and you will feel like hell, but you could get them both. COVID-19 really is a very serious threat. It's the worst threat from disease we have known for about a century. It won't be the Black Death, but it won't be fun. And there are several things that make it dangerous. It's highly infectious. It has a very long silent incubation period. And infectiousness appears to continue for at least a week after initial symptoms, maybe longer, we don't know yet. It also appears it may be possible to get this a second time, as if once wasn't enough. The U.S. death toll is likely to be very high. Initial mortality was estimated by the World Health Organization at 3.4%, which is way higher, by the way, than the Spanish flu pandemic 100 years ago, which was 3%. But many people are thinking that this may be too high an estimate because of the number of undiagnosed cases. Testing has been crap, I think is the technical term. And so we just don't know how many undiagnosed cases there are, both in the US and everywhere else in the world. But until we have widespread testing, we won't have good data on this. However, even if the death toll is only 0.5%, which is the low estimate by people who feel it, we don't know. That still means that the U.S. in the next 18 to 24 months are going to see 500,000 to 1 million additional deaths from this. And that's a pile of people. By comparison, the annual flu death rate is usually between 40 and 80,000, and the total death rate in the U.S. annually is about 2.7 million. Containment is simply no longer possible, so we're going to have a pandemic. It's going to happen. All of you are going to know somebody, maybe even more than one, who dies as a result of this. There will also be no vaccine for at least a year, despite what some people have said. No vaccine for at least a year and possibly as much as 18 months. Testing started yesterday in Seattle, I believe, on the first round of human tests on a vaccine. But it will take 2 to 3 rounds of human tests, assuming everything goes well, you understand. If there are problems, it's back to the drawing board for a little while. And then the FDA must approve the vaccine, which takes a little while, even with the pressure to approve a vaccine, you'll appreciate, after which it can then be mass produced, takes time, and distributed, takes time. As with the flu, we're also playing beat the clock because the coronavirus may mutate to the point that the developed vaccine does not work well. We know, for example, now, and have for about a month, there are two major strains of the virus, an L strain and an S strain, the form of which is more dangerous. Despite what the conspiracy theories say, it's not a bioweapon. People have been saying the Chinese invented this to do things, and apart from the utter stupidity of this in general, it's including the idea that a bioweapon that only kills a very small percentage of people is a really dumb bioweapon, and turning a bioweapon loose for which there is no vaccine for your own people is even dumber. The genome has been sequenced, and it's obvious that this is a naturally occurring version of coronavirus. Proving, though, that stupidity goes both ways, there have been claims recently from China that the U.S. manufactured this to do things to China. Oy vey. Vodka is not a disinfectant. It is better for drinking. They are not good disinfectants because the alcohol content is too low. Everclear, interestingly, is 190 proof, 95% pure alcohol, and that is a disinfectant. A couple of distilleries, one in Portland and one in Canada, are selling their waste alcohol, stuff that's very high test but is not drinkable because of side products. And these places normally use it for cleaning the floors as a sanitizer. Effects. Note this, and I think we're going to run over about 5 minutes past the time. Absenteeism. Assuming COVID-19 is going to continue growing in its impact in the US, which is unfortunately my bet, and I'm sorry, we will see 20% plus absenteeism in business in 4 to 6 months. But wait, there's less. There will, when people think, oh, 20% of the people won't be showing up for a few weeks, they tend to think maybe this person and that person not being here. But pandemics do not work that way. They tend to cluster. As with flu, COVID-19 transmits even easier than flu does. So what happens if the entire accounts receivable department is gone for 3 weeks? Or say your IT staff for the corporate headquarters is all sick. Do you have all your procedures written down now so that anybody with reasonable credentials could step in and take over? For example, if there are only 4 people who know how to do a necessary month-end task on the accounting servers, and 3 of them are out sick and 1 died, you have a real problem. Some businesses in the past have died suddenly because they could not complete necessary business processes because nobody knows how to do something essential, or knowledge was not actually locked in the head of somebody who actually died. There is a potential loss of public services. You have to have 9/11 operators. You have to keep actual people there to get emergency medical services, ambulances, police, fire, and so on. Someone has to keep the power grid running, the water and the sewer and the gas and the oil flowing. And the phones have to work and garbage has to get picked up. All of these things require a human being somewhere. With absenteeism running 20% or better, there are going to be degraded services. Depending on how bad things get during the pandemic, there will be mandatory shutdowns of services simply because there's no one available to do them. Count on the cable guy never showing up. The phones may not work reliably. Stores of all kinds may not be open, and when they are, they won't be stocked well. It's possible there will be food shortages because there aren't enough people to harvest the food, pack it, ship it, warehouse it, and stock it. Very specifically, there will be medical care shortages. Hang on a sec. We are already, and we're just at the very early days, seeing medical staff, particularly nursing staff, getting run ragged by the demands of COVID-19, and we haven't even begun to see the bulk of cases. Healthcare workers are at the most risk for exposure, moreover, and their infection rates will be higher than the general population. And because this tidal wave of sick people requiring care and attention is coming in, you can also count on healthcare workers working long hours until they're frazzled, and that's happening already. After the SARS epidemic, and that was a coronavirus too, there was a very high resignation rate in the 4 hospitals that had dealt with SARS patients. Now, the mortality there was about 10%, which is definitely worse. Healthcare workers left the field entirely because they'd burned out or they'd seen too many people die. This caused a serious shortage of medical personnel at all levels for a while. And the same thing on a national or global scale could mean a shortage of medical care across the country. And as you may have already heard, there is going to be a lack of hospital beds and ventilators, which will be responsible for a lot of deaths that might have been avoidable. Italy is already having this problem where doctors are having to make the hard call of who lives and who dies. At the peak of COVID-19, there are probably going to be as many as 30 or 40 patients for each hospital bed, each ICU bed, and each ventilator. And if the disease hits the acute respiratory syndrome level, which there is data on this on your likelihood, your chances of surviving without a ventilator are poor. There will be business shutdowns. Many businesses will shut their doors initially on a temporary basis because of lack of staff to run them. And in Washington State and many other places, we are seeing shutdowns, government enforced shutdowns, which are a good thing to keep people from passing the virus on. But it's going to become permanent for some of them. Restaurants, bars, public entertainments, nobody's going to sporting events, schools, air travel. Who in their right mind would get on a plane right now if you were not forced to do so? Tourism in general, lots of other things. And there's going to be a cascading effect with people who are hourly employees having no money and going bankrupt. And you can expect periodic failures, as I mentioned, of utilities, internet access, cable TV, and phones. Businesses that depend on long supply chains are going to be particularly vulnerable. And this, in turn, will lead to bankruptcies and possible economic collapse. The disease can easily knock someone off their feet for 6 weeks, which is forever for an hourly or self-employed person. Everybody who can afford it and can get it needs to have long-term disability insurance with a 1 month or 2 month waiting period right now if they haven't got it already. And there will still be a massive increase in bankruptcies. And here's the thing that's particularly scaring me is that the mortgage crisis of 2008 was triggered by a 1.8% default on mortgages. COVID-19 could cause as high as 4% in mortgage defaults. So people will need to step up and be decent. Everybody's going to need to cooperate more, to be more patient and be a little more thoughtful of each other. People are not good at this as a rule, and everybody right now is stressed. Knowing about all of this is not helping me sleep better at night, I guarantee you, but nonetheless, you need to take a moment and be decent and help other people occasionally so that you can pass a little calm along. The old motto of courtesy is contagious may be very helpful. And we're wrapping up. Key takeaways. You need to create and practice your crisis management plan beforehand. Do I really need to spell this one out? No, I think not. All crises have the potential to become global, even if it's a little local thing that happened at your company in Gopher Soup, Wyoming. It could easily end up on the news in New York or London. I just saw something yesterday. It was a silly bit of news. A woman in Vancouver, Washington, was had been washing her hands for a few days with something, and then realized a few days later that she had gotten drunk, she'd gotten something to eat late at night, and she'd left a slab of Tillamook brand sharp cheddar cheese out. It had dried a little, and she thought it was yellow soap. And she'd been washing her hands with soap. She posted this on Reddit, which was a dumb thing to do in my opinion, and I read about it in the Irish Post out of Dublin. So just be aware that things will travel. Make sure your communications would make you happy if you were reading or listening to them. It always shocks me, the drivel that sometimes gets spouted, that people think it's relevant and appropriate. Always try stuff out beforehand with someone who is not afraid to tell you you're completely FOS. Act and communicate like someone you'd want to know. This is part of don't be a jerk. Do not engage in pure marketing speak. Your audience will know it, by the way, and you will hear about it rapidly. Businesses can survive and thrive without a plan. Just because you don't have a plan in place, calm, careful thinking and adherence to a certain measure of process and goal-oriented action will get you out of this. And finally, COVID-19 is a very serious threat. It's not being played up in the press. It is not hype. It's very infectious, and it's something for which we currently have no cure, no vaccine, and very little in the way of symptomatic relief. There are countries already locked down. Italy, Spain, France, I think Germany is just about to in the next day or two. So wash your hands with soap and water anytime you leave or return to the house. Wash them at least every couple of hours regardless, for at least 20 seconds. I always sing the first portion of Bohemian Rhapsody to myself, but there's any number of other things you could do. Final thought here. Handling a crisis is all about communication. Without communication about what's going on, nobody can coordinate their efforts, nor apply the help that's needed, and even know if there's a problem at all. People will panic. You know, if you tried to buy disinfectant or toilet paper lately, people don't know what to do. People can't make enough money to pay their bills, and they go broke. Housing markets go soft, and economies can tank. So be careful. It's going to be rocky for a while. Thank you very much. Now, here are the resources. I'll mention these very briefly, and then I'm going to hand it back to Felice, and questions, I guess. bcinthecloud.com/c-19/daily is something interesting and depressing. It's officially diagnosed cases and deaths and recovered. The numbers are accelerating, but there's also good information as well. My book, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Disaster Preparedness, you can buy it on Amazon, used. I think you can still buy Kindle copies. You can get it from used book dealers. It's effectively out of print, so don't feel like I'm pimping my own book because I'm making money. I am not. This is just for your information. For those of you who need a crisis management plan, this link, which you'll be able to get to in the handout, gives you exactly that. Crisis communication plan examples and information on how to write your own. So go thou and do this. And finally, you can subscribe for free online to the Disaster Recovery Journal, which is a very interesting journal to read if you're at all inclined to do disaster recovery work. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that.